Gives me tremendous pleasure today to welcome Dr. Tom Allison to the Virtual Summer School in Entrepreneurship Research. Dr. Allison is a professor at the Neely School of Business, Texas Christian University. He's an editor at Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, one of the premier journals in entrepreneurship research. You might recall from our earlier discussion about the top 3 entrepreneurship journals, JBV, ET&P, and SCJ. His research interests are in the area of entrepreneurial finance. So entrepreneurial finance is his research area. Within that, he looks at novel forms of entrepreneurial resource acquisition, including crowdfunding, effects of narrative and rhetoric on investment decisions. He serves on the executive committee of the ENT division of the Academy of Management. And that's something you might have noticed in all the 3 speakers we've had so far and the speakers we're going to have going forward, is they not only are excellent researchers, but they also give their time generously to the field. And that's a wonderful quality you'll find in many, many entrepreneurship scholars. He received his PhD from the University of Oklahoma. Thank you and welcome, Tom, to this session.
Thank you, Vishal. And may I say that's also a quality you have in spades as well.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. Let me start with the first question, which we asked to all our speakers. How did you get interested in entrepreneurship research? Were you growing up thinking I'm going to be an entrepreneurship professor one day when I grow up? How?
Yeah, so I was an entrepreneur first. And there was always things about operations that baffled me and things that just seemed a lot harder than they had to be. So I went back after kind of winding down the venture and finished my degree. And I met Galen Chandler. This was at Wichita State University. And, at first I was fascinated by all of the obvious, that's so obvious things that he was teaching all of the students, right? And I was realizing how much time and effort I could have saved, right, in the process of running a venture if I would have finished my business degree first. I was doing a major in entrepreneurship. And then kind of once that wore off, I kind of started noticing how interesting I saw his job as being. And he got me involved in doing some research, and we ended up publishing the thing I worked with him as an undergraduate in Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal with Chris Broberg. That was some 11 years ago now. Yeah, I guess that's my origin story, because I was curious about some of the difficulties and phenomenon that I encountered as an entrepreneur. And in the process of getting answers to some of those things, I realized that being an entrepreneurship professor seemed like a pretty great job.
And do you think being an entrepreneurship professor, you got the answers to those questions? Because that's something that often comes up in these seminars. And like, how much do we answer the questions of entrepreneurs like you were in the past?
Well, I think like any scholar, there's far more questions than answers, and that's probably the part of an aspect of the job that I enjoy, right? It keeps you from being bored. Now, you're asking about translating those insights for practitioners. The field has been talking about how good of a job we do with relevance, right? Rigor versus relevance is kind of the big debate in AMJ probably a decade or more ago. So we've been talking about this for a long time, and I think it's appropriate that we always will be, because there's always going to be room for improvement, right, in translating theories into insights for practitioners. There's a number of excellent, more practitioner-focused avenues and outlets and initiatives that journals and professional societies have embarked upon. So I think big progress has been made there. And it's kind of like it's a Nike type thing. We're never going to be done. There's no finish line. It's an opportunity for continuous effort in translating research insights.
And as you think about your work as an entrepreneur previously and your work as an entrepreneurship professor now, how do you think the mindset shift or the mindset change works? Was a mindset shift needed were the qualities that allowed you to be successful or thrive in one the same as those that allow you to succeed and thrive in the other?
Yeah, I feel like there is a remarkable parallel. One thing that pops to mind is my venture was sort of a business to business venture, so I would always be every week meeting new entrepreneurs and going into new businesses, learning about companies and their problems and industries that I wasn't familiar with before. And of course, I was there to to sell our services, but in the process of that, I was kind of continuously seeing venture opportunities, right? Oftentimes, when you're talking to somebody, you'll realize in kind of the problems they're identifying that there's actually a specific entrepreneurial opportunity there. And I suppose the same kind of thing happens to me as a scholar, as an academic, in the process of trying to answer one question, several others will pop up, right? So I'll see opportunities for papers in the process of kind of going about my normal job of trying to publish, the current project that I'm working on.
Okay. Can you now you've been doing crowdfunding research for a long time now. Can you share with us your insights on how crowdfunding research has evolved and where you see it going in the future? In the chat, somebody earlier commented that they go to conferences now and they find that senior people are discouraging them from doing crowdfunding research. So what's your view on this?
Probably like most topics that pop into the literature, it started out quite phenomenological and very descriptive. And there's room for us, a relatively small number of such papers. So the next kind of port of call was more theory-driven examinations. And we're now kind of departing from that phase and entering the phase where it's not enough to answer yet another kind of question to describe another aspect of the phenomenon, but it needs to shape our understanding of entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial processes more broadly. So I would say that there's still ample opportunity for crowdfunding research. And just kind of for the last 4 to 5 years, it's been necessary to use it as an avenue to answer entrepreneurship questions, things that are interesting to readers of journals more broadly. Because, of course, crowdfunding itself is familiar enough that it's not interesting in itself, right? But it can still be quite a valuable phenomenon through which to answer a number of questions that we have about key entrepreneurial processes, right? How do entrepreneurs get resources? How do they develop legitimacy? How do they marshal the support of others? How do they communicate? I mean, these things are core to being a human and running a business, creating startups. Crowdfunding still provides a pretty good avenue into these things. By no means do I think it's the only kind of research that anyone should be interested in. I certainly have other interests. Frequently, I kind of get pulled back into doing crowdfunding things because of past doctoral students who are still working in the space, and collaborators who seek me out. Is it good advice to look elsewhere than crowdfunding? I would say the broader advice that I would take from senior scholars giving such advice would be, it's very helpful to a junior scholar, somebody just starting out on their journey, to identify a promising area where you can become one of the most memorable 20 people in the field, something like that. So it would be difficult to do that in crowdfunding because there probably are more than 20 or so people that people think of in terms of crowdfunding research, right? So it's hard to join that once the party has already kind of begun. And I think it's always good advice to look for opportunities to define a new area of research. You don't have to be the first, right? But if you can be among the first, that's very beneficial to your career. And obviously it helps tremendously in being able to have a clear narrative for yourself, right? About what kind of researcher you are, what your purpose is, how you're seeking to help entrepreneurs, and how you're seeking to define the science of understanding entrepreneurship.
So Tom, you talked about that a young scholar or a junior scholar or a new scholar is better off trying to be one of the top people in a new area or an emerging area rather than being sort of one of 150 who is already doing research on crowdfunding or, I don't know, entrepreneurial orientation or one of those. But people who are new to the area, they also face significant legitimacy challenges. So how did you deal with that early in your career? How would you advise people deal with that?
I'll give a caveat that there's tremendous equifinality in being a researcher. I'm sure you found the same, Vishal. There's all kinds of ways to be successful as a scholar. Um, there's no one right choice in terms of research strategy, publication strategy, way to define yourself. But yes, I agree with you that trying to define and be a leader in a new area poses other risks, right? The risk of being told that this is not an interesting question, there's no conversation about this, no one is having this conversation in this journal. Um, I suppose this is maybe more of a publication strategy than a research strategy, right? The publication strategy that comes to mind is to try to bootstrap it in various ways, right? So you seek to be accepted to Babson or to the Academy Entrepreneurship Division to present a paper, and then maybe put it in the proceedings, right? So you have a citation to reference. It is tremendously important to view scholarship generally, and especially defining a new area, as a shared enterprise, right? You need to involve others in your research, right? Which is why, of course, it's important to present new ideas for new kind of phenomenon, because it's not something that one person can do themselves, right? You're very unlikely to be successful in publishing in a brand new area with no supporting ecosystem of researchers. So I think those two things together help somewhat, but yeah, absolutely, it's true, and it was the case in terms of publishing crowdfunding research 12, 13 years ago, that there were many rejections, right? Some editors and reviewers thought that crowdfunding was a cool phenomenon and they were interested in it, but others, felt like it gave an artificial picture of venture funding when venture funding was understood to be a conversation about angels and venture capital and IPOs. So it does also take time, right? It takes time to define the area. Um, so I would say view it as a strategy in terms of defining yourself as a scholar, as your research agenda. I'm not necessarily advising that this is the way to go about getting a dissertation done, right? Or getting a paper published so you can go on the market, or maybe even getting tenure, right? If you have very hard time limits on when you must publish some kind of scholarly output, right? If you must publish or perish, figuratively, a new area isn't always the safest bet. But it varies from person to person, their risk tolerance, what they want to choose.
Yeah, I guess like an entrepreneur, right? I mean, you can choose sort of how much of these battles you want to fight. So as I look through my notes in terms of, things I'm writing down as you're speaking, I think there's two issues that I want to sort of go back to. One is you said you were running a B2B business,
Mhm.
and then, here you are today. But I think we missed sort of how does somebody who was running a B2B business get interested in crowdfunding research, which is not at all B2B?
Sure. Okay. Great question. So we were just kind of chronically undercapitalized. So we had an angel that put in kind of small, kind of mid five figures into the business. Um, but there were just never enough resources. And I'm not sure I really recognized that as kind of the underlying problem when I was operating the venture. But stepping back from it after things had wound up, it was very clear to me that the fundamental problem was constantly just an insufficient level of capitalization, right? The venture was just undercapitalized, kind of in the Townsend and Bushnett sense. Um, and it was eye-opening to realize that there was a whole academic literature, right, that understands that problem and explains it. And it wasn't frustrating. It was befuddling to realize that there was a whole decades of scholarship, right, that could have helped me see this problem, understand that the strategic risks that it poses to the venture, and realize that it was something so destructive that it really did require attention and not just working around. So why did that translate into crowdfunding? Crowdfunding wasn't a thing when I was running the venture. Didn't exist then. But seeing crowdfunding, I realized that for some types of ventures, certainly not business to business ventures, but for some ideas, crowdfunding offered a tremendous bridge between the idea that the entrepreneur had and the enterprise they wanted to create. There's all kinds of folks that have great ideas for ventures, and they just don't happen because of the lack of resources. So that's why I'm interested in crowdfunding. Is I think there's a large population that, because of the lack of social networks, so not the online kind, the human kind, just don't have access to traditional, so-called traditional institutional sources of capital, venture capital, angels, banks, where that makes sense from a risk standpoint. And crowdfunding offers a tremendous opportunity for some of those folks to see their idea turned into an enterprise, which I think is tremendously motivational, given all that we know about how good entrepreneurship is for people and families and communities.
Okay. And the other question sort of I have in my notes here is, I know we talked about how the low-hanging fruit has sort of been taken in crowdfunding research, has been picked, and how, the pool of researchers is now much bigger than what it was when you started out. But I'm sure there must be some possibilities or some avenues in crowdfunding research that you go, oh, I wish I was starting out my career today. This is what I would like to have examined, because I would have the time or the inclination or whatever to pursue this path in crowdfunding research that nobody's looked at.
Sure. I appreciate that question. So it's very much still a very active area of research, which I can, I'll tell you from my perspective as one of the editors of ETP. So I every month see several interesting papers and do my best working with reviewers to try to develop those manuscripts. And of course, unfortunately, at ETP, we're only able to accept something like 7% of submissions. So while most of them don't get published, some of them do. I myself am working on like 7 crowdfunding papers right now, and I think 4 or 5 of those are R&Rs. So it is still an active area, and there's still fruit to be harvested, will be plucked. I would tell you that one area that is largely kind of terra nova, right, unexplored land, is post-campaign outcomes, right? So almost all of the crowdfunding literature is focused on determinants of success, right? What are the things that entrepreneurs do and say? What are the actions they take that translate into raising funding? And that's obviously important, right? That goes to kind of the core mission of my research program that I set out for you a few minutes ago, right? The idea of bridging between idea and enterprise. What hasn't been looked at, and what I think is tremendously important, is what are the outcomes for ventures that raise money from crowdfunding? Do they even deliver the promised rewards, right? In the example of rewards-based crowdfunding, turning to equity-based crowdfunding, which hasn't been a huge force in the United States, but has been quite influential in Europe and in the United Kingdom. Equity-based crowdfunding, lots of questions are unanswered, right? What happens to these ventures? Do they raise money from the crowd, and then do they keep growing, or do they just kind of steady state, or do they fail? What are the stakeholder and agency and governance issues that arise from having hundreds of shareholders, right? Is that a manageable situation for entrepreneurs? my intuition is that it's very difficult to have hundreds of shareholders, because on any given day, you might have one of them emailing you offering help, giving you an idea, thinking they're helping you, offering updates, asking for updates, excuse me. Um, and my intuition, but it's only an intuition, is that that might be very distracting to an entrepreneur. And that might keep them from actually executing their plan and building the business. But it's only an intuition because I'm not aware of any publication on that, right? And that would be tremendously interesting to know. It would, of course, also be interesting to know, do such ventures go on to attract VC funding? I've seen some suggestion that VCs look down upon companies that have used equity crowdfunding. Not clear necessarily if that's true of rewards-based crowdfunding. So those are a couple examples, or two families of examples of things that are largely unexplored, that things that lie after the funding is achieved. I mean, what happens after that? And they're not looked at probably for the reason so much as not understood about entrepreneurship, which is the fact that it is hard, and it requires different methods and time-consuming methods to really get in there and observe what happens with ventures.
Right. And there is the street light effect in our research, right? We focus on where the light is rather than saying, I'm going to take the light somewhere where I think it needs to be. So
Yeah, you put your finger right on it. That's exactly what it is, Vishal.
thank you, Tom. And you said you're an editor, and you're an editor at one of the top journals in the field, and you review many, many papers every year as an editor and as a reviewer. What do you look for in a paper? Because what I'm told is at top journals, most of the papers are dead, are rejected. So
Mhm.
what do you look for in a paper?
Well, again, I would argue that there's equifinality and there's no one path. So there's multiple things that make a paper publishable, and I never expect the paper to be perfect. Um, and that's not just the humility of knowing how imperfect my own research is, but it's also a recognition of things like the streetlight effect, right? So if we expect, for example, methodological um, purity, then we're primarily only going to publish studies that kind of benefit from the streetlight effect and related phenomena. Um, that said, there are some kind of bright line things that ETP doesn't do. We don't do like a single survey, basically, right, where there might be common method bias designs, right? You could, of course, get around that by doing multiple surveys or multiple experiments or something like that. But I suppose the number one thing that I look for is some kind of controversy, right? Which is another way of saying there's a potential interesting conversation. So if one reviewer really hates the paper, and there's well-defined reasons why they hate it, right? And maybe another reviewer is very adamant that this is an interesting conversation, right? That's actually a pretty good sign sometimes that there is a conversation that readers would be interested in, right? Not just a conversation that the literature would benefit from, but what we mean by when we say contribute to the literature in a human sense is a manuscript, something that if it came out in PDF, if you got the email with the title and the abstract, you'd say, "Huh, that sounds interesting," right? And you would take a moment to read it. Um, so that's really the number one thing. That's what I aspire to, is to help develop authors' interesting papers, things that readers will find worth their time. And there's of course other things that are maybe less interesting, but more that serve a kind of service purpose in the literature, um, that I would seek to publish as well. Um, but I suppose, yeah, just kind of the number one metric is if you got the email, you would find this interesting enough to at least start reading it.
And is there any advice you have for people who are aspiring to publish in ET&P, where, they submit a paper, they think it's interesting, but you read the paper as an editor and you go, I don't see interesting. What is there things they can do to sort of make the paper be perceived as more interesting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm thinking of like the listicles or the social media phenomenon, right? Where there's says like one weird trick to make your manuscript more likely to be accepted, right? So there's no one weird trick. But there are all sorts of difficult but rewarding choices that you can make to make an article more likely to pass the desk reject phase and be likely to be sent out to reviewers and be likely to be received positively by reviewers. I, I suppose the number one thing that immediately pops to mind is related manuscripts in ETP, right? So when we say a conversation in the literature or a conversation in the journal that readers are interested in, I mean, we're not trying to be folksy by using the word conversation. We're actually being literal. We're saying that this is something that others have written about. It's related to things others have written about in ETP. And we want to continue that quite literal conversation I mean, it's obviously not a verbal conversation, but it's a back and forth in the literature, or something that's being built up in the literature. So the biggest sign of that you can tell as an author, as somebody working on a manuscript, thinking about where to send it, is look at your references. Who did you happen to cite? Right? What are the journals that I'm drawing upon? And even just as important is what is the time period of those references, right? Are they 2020 and 2022, or are they 1986, right? Because if you have 14 ETP citations from like 1983 through 1993, well, that was a conversation in ETP, in the pages of ETP, but it's probably a conversation that will be difficult to reopen because many of the readers and many of the participants, the other authors that were working on it, may have moved on to other things, or maybe indeed have moved on full stop. Um, Now, it's not actually something that I do as an editor. I don't look at the back and see, are you citing ETP? Because I don't care by the time it's been submitted, right? I'm just going to read the manuscript and make a decision. But as an author, it's always a good little quick acid test to look at the back of your own manuscript and see the timeliness and the venue, right? Is this a timely conversation, and where is this conversation being had? And usually that's the best place to start, wherever that might be, right? It might be ETP, but it could be SEJ or JBV, or it could be, org science. It could be a number of places. That's probably usually the best place to start, unless you have career-based concerns, right? The timeliness and things, then you might change your decision.
Okay. And one of the examples you gave of something that would be sort of dead on arrival at ET&P is single shot surveys because of common method and so on. Are there any other things that are almost dead on arrival for you as an editor?
Um, hmm. Well, it's disappointing when a manuscript fails to take notice of the prior literature in a way that makes it not novel, right? So it's not dead on arrival in the sense that I never look at it, but once you notice that, that your hypothesis is the same thing as this other paper that's from 3 years ago or 10 years ago, it's really hard to justify at that stage sending the manuscript out to reviewers. Um, Reviewers are not the enemy of authors, right? We're a team, we're partners. Reviewers genuinely actually do want to see manuscripts published, and of course, editors do as well. We're in the business of taking your manuscript and getting it published. We don't obviously individually make any money, but this is the purpose that we're engaged in. Um, The thing about reviewers, though, is they're human, and like any human, if you waste somebody's time, they get frustrated, right? So editors make the choice to send something out or not, partially on the basis of conserving reviewer time and reviewer goodwill, their willingness to say yes and read a manuscript. And if we don't husband that carefully, right? If that's not a resource, reviewer goodwill is not something that we care for and are careful with, then it's bad for everybody, right? Because that means in the future, reviewers are going to be less likely to say yes when you send something to ETP and we ask somebody to review it, which we have to have done, of course, which would slow down our editorial process tremendously and make the journal much less valuable to authors. So we never desk reject things out of any kind of frustration, right? We do it to protect everybody's interests, at least long run. I'm sure it doesn't feel that way getting desk rejected. I've been desk rejected myself plenty of times. Um, but yes, it's very unlikely to have a good outcome, right? If your hypotheses are something that essentially isn't novel, right? Whether it's something that's been done before or if it's something that existing theory already predicts, perhaps sometimes in a different context.
Okay. You mentioned you've been desk rejected several times in the past, and you were not there for our earlier session where we were talking about how you have been listed as one of the top crowdfunding researchers in the world. So does that mean you never get rejected anymore? Does that mean all your papers sail through?
No, yeah, so all the time, and I know you'll get the same answer if you ask anybody. It's a process that has some randomness built in, and it's also a process that even people who've published a lot aren't perfect at, right? Sometimes I'll think something's interesting and other people will not agree, and that's expected, and that shouldn't make you feel bad, right? It's just a matter of framing the study in a way that persuades others, right? Or it's just a matter of helping to develop the literature in a direction to where at some point in the future, right, it's the question that you're trying to ask that you've been told is not interesting or um, isn't worth having, isn't a question worth asking right now. At some future point with work in shaping the literature in a direction that it becomes timely and worth asking. So it's possible to be too early with a research question. It's possible to be too late with a research question. It's possible to just make a mistake in your experimental design or something like that that undermines the manuscript. And all three of those things are things that I've done. Um, I still make plenty of mistakes, right? And when I get rejected, it's not just that it's not time for the question, right? Sometimes it's just that I've made a bad choice somewhere in either the choice of theory or the methods. And it's just a process of feedback.
Okay. Um, so can you tell us about one crowdfunding research paper that you are working on these days? How did you get the idea? How did you put together the research team? How did you decide where to submit it? Or perhaps you haven't decided yet, so you can walk them through how you are making that decision.
Sure, okay. Um, yeah, so let me see. So you probably want something that is close to submission. All right, well, I'll talk about something that I'm working on that I'll be presenting at Babson then. Uh, how did I get let's start with how I got the idea. So I have three kids. Well, they're visible behind me. I suppose they're not. Penelope, Rowan, and Ferris. They're quite young, and some of them I won't say who uses the slang, but some of them use slang that I've heard like my students use, and I always think that's interesting, or I thought it was funny, I guess, that I'm hearing my students and my own children kind of use slang terms that have become kind of popular in social media and things. Uh, and it just kind of cracks me up to use these slang phrases back to my kids, because it's very obvious that they're embarrassed by hearing their dad say, you know, bet or no cap and things like that, and it just gives me all kinds of pleasure to embarrass them, um, as a father, I guess, for some reason. So that got me thinking about, well, I my undergraduates are, well, a couple of them actually are currently entrepreneurs. There's a couple of them that are running ventures right now, which I'm tremendously proud of. And of course, many of them will go on to start ventures in the future. Um, and maybe one of my own kids will become an entrepreneur. And what is the role of these slang phrases, right? How's that shape the way that an entrepreneur is perceived, right? The framework that I and my co-authors are using for this is professionalism versus being relatable, right? And I think our intuition, and this is still pretty early stage. We're hoping to someday maybe send this to JPV. We'll see. That's a decision we'll probably make a little bit further on once we've done the primary data collection. We've only done some secondary data collection, content analysis from crowdfunding campaigns so far. But the perspective that we have on this is maybe using slang, right? Maybe using these Zoomer generation phrases that have become popular on social media. Maybe that makes an entrepreneur in their campaign more relatable, right? But perhaps at a cost of maybe seeming less professional, right? And to me, that's kind of an ideal tension because that sets up some sort of curvilinear relationship, which is usually a little bit of an easier sell. It seems more, in the sense that it seems more interesting, right? And things that seem more interesting are, I don't want to say a safer bet because research shouldn't be about making safe bets. Things that seem more interesting seem like a better use of my time because I want to spend most of my time doing research that other people want to read. I want the research to be read. So the fact that there's kind of a tension up in kind of opposing directions, I think is potentially quite interesting. So what we're doing right now is some an experiment, right, to see truly is it the case that the mechanism is that the use of slang undermines um, perceptions of professionalism while making somebody more relatable, and kind of what's the net effect of that. And
Okay.
in terms of slang, I mean, I think the specific phrases are irrelevant because slang is an ancient phenomenon, right? So this is really this is an entrepreneurship study because we're studying new ventures, but in commerce, people have been using neologisms, new words, before they've become legitimized and been popularized for, we'd have to assume since the beginning of language, right? And trading and things like that. Um, so any kind of slang, right? So I would envision this to be very generalizable.
Okay. So you got the idea from something that you were seeing in your classroom and in your family,
Hmm.
and then you're working on this paper that you hope to submit to JBV. But then, where in this process did you convince one or two or three other people that this is worth doing together?
Yes, I'm working on it with my colleagues Aaron, Blakely, and Ben. Um, so I find this is usually for me, this works the best. I prefer this from others, and I like to do this myself. I will write down basically an extended abstract, a Babson type length document. Sometimes I'll go as far as a full intro, right? So I'll get my thoughts down on paper. And then if I have somebody in mind that I'd like to collaborate with, that I think would be a good fit, I will send them that. I'll say, here's something I'm thinking about. Do you have any thoughts? And kind of depending on how well I know them, right? If they're kind of past collaborators, I might directly say, would you be interested? oh, if there's somebody who I've never worked with before, I might ask their opinion and then reply back once they reply to me if they'd be interested in joining. I would never want to seem kind of presumptuous and assuming somebody would want to collaborate. Many people do, but not everybody. Um, so I think it's very important to put something on paper because it's very easy, at least for me, to have ideas that make all kinds of sense when they're only up here, but once you write them down, like there's very obvious like flaws, right? So the writing down is critical. And I would only want to ask the indulgence of somebody else's time once I'd taken the step for myself to put the logic down, convince myself like 70% that it makes a little bit of sense at least. So that's usually what I do. It doesn't need to be long. It could be 700 words. It could be 4 pages, double spaced. But some kind of basic, here's the relationship. Here's why I think it's important. Here's the literature we might use. Here are some potential contributions. But no, at that stage, no method or measures. Maybe some potential ways we might come at it if it is something that makes sense as an empirical paper.
I think that's good advice. I've heard other successful people also in our profession also say this is what they like to see is somebody actually write down a 1 page or a 2 page explanation of what, because in the head, everything sounds very good. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Asan, who's one of our participants, had a question about database in crowdfunding. And so Asan, do you want to go ahead and ask your question on camera? Asan Jalo?
Yes, thank you, First Officer.
Yes,
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Allison. How are you? Thank you for sharing
good.
some insights. So,
Tom is plenty. Please call me Tom. Yeah, good to meet you.
okay, thank you. So, with regards to data availability and accessibility, can you share context or provide statistical insights and trends on GoFundMe or equity based, that is crowd cube data? And then the second question that is also aligned is what role can triangulation, looking at different statistical tools with regards to mixed methods, can play in enhancing the validity and the reliability of crowdfunding research findings?
Okay, so you're asking me about data methods triangulation,
Yes.
and you're asking about Crowdcube, and did you also say GoFundMe?
Yeah, GoFundMe. Just giving me an example of Crowdcube and GoFundMe because I just wanted you to share some, statistical insights
Like
because I
data
know that there is
availability.
data.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is data availability, with regards to data availability and accessibility, because I know it is well researched in Europe compared to US. So I wanted
Yes.
to know how do you make sure that the data is reliable and is also accurate, and then who is also where can one access the data? Where is the data seated?
Hmm. Okay, so with Crowdcube, I've seen plenty of manuscripts using Crowdcube data. I think anytime you have a database that essentially anybody can access, whether by scraping or whether by getting a copy of somebody else's download of the data, it's really, really important to have some kind of plus, right? Some kind of add-on data. So with Crowdcube, the opportunity that I would see would be to gather some kind of other data on these same projects and companies that you can add on to the Crowdcube data, right? So then the Crowdcube data becomes maybe your outcome, and the other data that you collect separately becomes, your rare, valuable resource that not everybody has that is the predictor. Or it could be the other way around, of course, which I suppose leads me to speaking about a different kind of triangulation, data triangulation. In terms of thinking about reliability of data, this is something that I often see mentioned with like Crunchbase data. Crunchbase can be a very useful data source for some research questions, but it really works a lot better from the standpoint of doing good science if you can observe the same companies from some other database as well, whether that's information that you collect or hand code or something like Venture Expert or SDC Platinum or Thompson One. With regard to GoFundMe, we looked at like this thing with like restaurants, mostly it was restaurants that were struggling during the pandemic. So I think there are some entrepreneurship questions that can be answered with GoFundMe. Of course, the question you'll get from editors and reviewers about GoFundMe is, in terms of data validity, is what screening have you done to ensure that these are individuals that are seeking funds for a venture and not people asking only for money for personal use. There is a stream of research on individual crowdfunding that answers other questions that organizational scholars might care about, some marketing research, some charitable donation research. But mostly that falls kind of outside the domain of what I've looked at. What other questions did you have? Did I answer it at all?
Yeah, so if in terms of data accessibility, if someone is new to crowdfunding research, where would you suggest them to start?
I see. There is so Kiva, for example, which is like donation-based crowdfunding, has a database that you can download, and they have an API as well. Some of the other crowdfunding platforms also have an API, and you can use Python to and an API key that you're allowed to use to gather that data. I think there's a company called Web Robots. It's webrobots.io that has a relatively old but still useful kind of database dump of Kickstarter that they manually scraped, and they may still keep that up to date. I'm aware of actually a couple different kind of websites that have Kickstarter data that somebody else has kind of scraped and downloaded. And if you search on GitHub or Reddit for Kickstarter database download, or just Google, you'll come across 2 or 3 of those.
Wonderful. Priscilla had a question about common method bias. Priscilla, do you want to go ahead and ask?
Sure. You hearing me?
Yes, I can hear you. Nice to meet you, Priscilla.
Oh, same here. My question is, I do a lot of survey work, and I have to rely on the use of surveys, cross-sectional designs. And you mentioned earlier that common method bias is one of the red flags that may prevent you from getting published in those top journals. Could you provide me any advice on what other methods I can use? Perhaps I'm thinking in my mind, if I can probably administer the survey in 2 different times, I don't know if that would help, or if I have to use like a sequential qualitative design. If you can help me understand, how do I combat this common method? Thank you.
Sure. So the APA it has a number of suggestions, and I'd probably defer to that body because they've obviously spent a lot more time thinking about all the possible ways to address it. So one of their journals, like the Journal of Applied Psychology, in their like guide for authors, has a pretty comprehensive list of what to do, basically. So I probably mostly refer you to that. You mentioned collecting at 2 different points in time. That's a reasonable strategy. I think you still need to explain specifically every time you do that how the introduction of time in between addresses some of it. In my mind, the best thing to do, though, is usually to have some kind of other outcome that's going to be observed in some other way other than the survey, right? So that could be observational. It could be doing an experiment in addition to your survey, right? Something to demonstrate, to establish some evidence of causality in addition to like psychometrics, where you're more kind of limited to correlational approaches. So that would be my maybe that's more my individual suggestion. I don't think I'm necessarily speaking as an editor there. That's my intuition of, as an author, my best strategy is to avoid the problem altogether, right? Do the survey, but think of some way in which the outcome can be some other method, or vice versa, right? You could have the outcome be a survey, but there's some other kind of predictor. And then, of course, check out the APA's advice because it's very comprehensive.
Thank you.
And Tom, would you say that's where the field is going in general? Is single shot survey papers are more difficult to publish at top journals?
I don't see that many of them. And maybe that's because at the editor-in-chief level, these things are advised against, right? And I know, as I mentioned, a number of top scholarly associations have kind of taken even a stronger stance, like the APA, on advising against it. I just feel like the field is going more in the direction of multi-method. Maybe I feel like that's actually the theme. It's not a prohibition. Like there are legitimate times when everything on a survey might still be of value, right? But it's difficult to think of a manuscript getting accepted with that as its only empirical component, right? You could still have, as a pilot or something that really does have like the drawback of potential common method issues, variants and whatnot. But if that was paired with some other design, some other approach, some other method, then that becomes less of a problem. And I think that's been a long-term trend, and I certainly see that in the manuscripts that I handle. And I certainly have seen that as an author, as an expectation set by reviewers, that there's more and more expectation that any manuscript will have kind of multiple studies or multiple data sources, multiple methods. And of course, scientifically, there's all the reason in the world to have greater confidence when a manuscript has more than one source of evidence.
Perfect. Thank you. Tamara had a question. Tamara, do you want to go ahead and ask your question on camera?
Hi, Tamara.
Yeah, hi. Real quick, I don't know if this is off topic or not. I do a lot of work with pitch competitions on campuses, college campuses. And, I know some of the students, they get the money and, whatever, they don't really do anything with it. And I know others that have launched like really successful enterprises. And I wonder if there's been any studies around that, or does that fall into your wheelhouse at all as a source of funding?
It's interesting. I think I'm aware of some people have looked at like off-campus pitch competitions. So things like Crunchbase, they host like some kind of startup thing, Y Combinator, their like pitch type competition. I would say that it's to me, at least from an entrepreneurial education standpoint, in terms of understanding the effectiveness of what we do in the classroom, does it make people more or less likely to become entrepreneurs? It would be interesting to know, what are the reasons for which people get the money and then do nothing with it, or get the money and then choose to start the venture? Obviously, it's probably more interesting to know like the negative case there, right? Why do people receive the funds and then do nothing? Were they never planning to do anything? Was it just a class requirement and they were pleased to receive the money, or did they have some kind of entrepreneurial intention and then they backed off? Honestly, I'm not as well versed in the education piece of the literature, so I would certainly take a look at AMLE, Academy of Management, Learning and Education, and some of the other literature, because there definitely is quite a bit on like when entrepreneurial intentions develop. I don't know if there's anybody that's looked at that kind of post-pitch competition.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I think, one of the papers that people read of yours for today is the Preparedness and Passion paper in JBV.
Yeah,
and I think one of the papers that it builds on, the Chen Kota paper, they use the context of student pitch competitions. Is my memory off on that?
I think that's right. That sounds right to me. Yeah.
So I think there is potential in publishing at good journals if done well. Yeah.
Yeah, it can like I was saying, think multi-method when all possible. So it's a great way to have greater access to the entrepreneurs, right, or the potential entrepreneurs than you would in other data collection contexts, right? So by itself, student pitch probably not enough, but in addition to something else, could well be persuasive evidence.
Yeah. So Sanjeev had a question about valuation and crowdfunding. Sanjeev, do you want to go ahead and ask?
Yes, Professor, thank you. Professor, my question to you is about the valuation of crowdfunding. I was wondering whether the traditional methods of valuation would be applicable for crowdfunding or not, because you have the uneducated investor, you have what part of equity, if there is an equity-based crowdfunding happening. So I think all of these can impact the valuation of crowdfunding. So I was wondering whether this is a genuine problem, and if I think someone was writing also whether blockchain could be a solution for better valuation.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say definitely it's still valid, right? I mean, you're just gonna even in rewards-based crowdfunding, you could still do financials and take the present value of those expected future cash flows. In equity crowdfunding, obviously, it's extremely applicable, and we probably use very traditional valuation methods. I suppose the interesting question with rewards-based crowdfunding is more around who's the valuation for and who's making use of it, right? Because if there is no external source of equity, then there's less of an audience for any kind of projection, right? So it'd be interesting to know, do the creators of rewards-based crowdfunding, do they actually think about the valuation of the venture they're creating, right? Do they do formal financials, right? Or do they only think about the profit and loss of the reward they're creating to give to the founders? And I don't really have a lot of personal knowledge of blockchain research, so I'd probably have to say probably not the person to be best able to answer that question.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Perfect. Kai, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes. Hello, Professor Allison. I'm doing research about that. So I'm thinking about, is that really important to deal with multicollinearity or endogeneity in this crowdfunding field? Because I didn't see a lot of paper did something about endogeneity, but it seems to be important. Is there any latest trend that we can deal with that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of sources. There's kind of two different questions, I suppose. There's all kinds of predictors that might be collinear with each other. Usually what you see is just kind of the standard diagnostics around that. I guess I would once again repeat the familiar refrain that if you have a multi-homed approach to the truth, a multi-method approach to gathering evidence, then potential flaws in any one method don't matter as much, right? That's not to say that they don't matter, but they don't matter as much. I don't usually see multicollinearity as a significant threat to validity in the models that I see in crowdfunding manuscripts. At least the evidence that the authors share don't make me feel that way. And I've never really seen reviewers flag too many issues other than obvious mistakes that the authors recognize once them being pointed out. You're also asking about endogeneity. And of course, there's all kinds of sources of endogeneity, right? I mean, you have the underlying kind of quality of the venture and its idea, and that's something that isn't controlled for all that much, probably because it's relatively subjective, right? The underlying quality of the idea is probably best proxied by the fundraising outcome, and that's the thing that we're usually trying to predict. So it's probably something that we mostly try to address by, once again, I'll repeat the refrain, having a multi-method approach to developing data. We definitely realize there's all sorts of sources of endogeneity, and we just look for, have authors done what they can to address that?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ramjanul Ahsan had a question about the changing landscape of crowdfunding. So Ramjanul, do you want to ask?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. So the question I had, basically, Tom said he's not the right person to talk about blockchain. So I'm going to rephrase the question so that maybe it aligns with your field.
I appreciate that, thanks.
Yeah, so do you think with this AI, entrepreneurs, they can source their resources better in terms of identifying that this is the possible way we can approach.
Am I still connected?
Yeah.
I didn't hear the end of the question. Could you repeat?
The question is, does AI help entrepreneurs do a better job efficiently, effectively at reaching potential resource providers?
Oh, I see. Well, definitely it could, right? It could definitely help in identifying people on social networks that are possible influencers, right? That might be important nodes to reach out to offline or off of the crowdfunding platform. There's all kinds of positive and negative, of course, influences on campaign outcomes that AI could provide insights to the entrepreneur in improving the quality of their pitch, right? And even something as simple as AI making it easy, right, and relatively trivial to create a video pitch. That could be something to look at, right? Does a AI created video perform worse or better, right? And there's reasons to expect it might be either, right? The AI video might be seen to be artificial and maybe a sign that the entrepreneur didn't work, or that maybe it's some kind of even potential fraud. On the other hand, a lot of people don't have much in the way of professional ability in terms of producing a video, right? That's not something that necessarily goes with having a venture idea. So I think there's all kinds of possibilities there. And the challenge will probably just be to explain how addressing some AI, any particular AI tool, right, for working on a campaign is interesting to readers because of some connection it has to a core entrepreneurship process or phenomena that readers will broadly care about, even if they don't care about crowdfunding or even if they don't care about AI. That's a good intuition, good question you asked there. Thank you.
Yeah, so Tom, I know we said 1 hour, and we are already past time. So if you don't mind, we'll just allow one more audience question and then start wrapping up. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
So Oscar, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, many thanks for the presentation. Hi. So my question is thank you once again. And my question is regarding the not only crowdfunding, but today there are so many cheap ways of financing new ideas. I mean, at least the genesis of the project. So talking with some entrepreneurs that I've been interviewing, I realized that the notion of risk for them is like minimum, or they don't see any risk in launching their ideas. So my question is, do you think that these new sources of financing in some free way, cheap way, might be diluting the risk perception of the entrepreneurial orientation construct, at least at the genesis of the project?
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I'm immediately seeing the connection to entrepreneurial orientation or EO, but I do think you raise the risk question and risk perceptions question you're raising is apt and interesting. It does seem pretty intuitive that crowdfunding by democratizing funding, right, reduces the costs of seeking funding and thus reduces the stakes and the risks, right? You're creating a web page and maybe a video, and how much time and money does that take versus the time and money it would take to make an actual prototype and take it around to see angel investors. So I think probably is true that the risk is lower because the costs of trying and failing are lower than they ever have been before. I guess something being intuitive is dangerous, though, in science, because if something's too intuitive, then it seems obvious to readers and potential reviewers. I think that is true. So you would kind of just need to. I suspect that what you're saying is true. I'm not aware of anybody systematically investigating it, I'm sure there are some interesting research questions that flow from a reduction in kind of the barriers to entry, right? The seeking funding. Maybe people are more likely to become entrepreneurs. Maybe this is a conversation about hybrid entrepreneurship. Maybe people are more likely to keep working at their regular job, but also pursue a project on the side. And the way in which they think about that might be interesting to study. There might be questions around rates of entrepreneurship in the economy. So it might be an interesting macro question. So I think your insight is a good one. And I'm not aware of anybody that's talking about that. I think it is true. You just kind of, I guess, need to come up with a research question related to it that you think is interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you. Many thanks.
yeah, that was an interesting question about the lower risk perceptions. I hadn't thought about it before he asked that. So Tom, I could go on, and we could go on and on asking you questions and picking your thoughts, but we do need to wind up. So let me ask you the last question we ask all our speakers. What's one advice you would offer to our participants who may be new to entrepreneurship research?
Yeah, say hello to everybody you can. It's an extremely welcoming, friendly group of people. I think you're already seeing that. Vishal is a wonderfully friendly presence. All of the highly published people in the field that are coming to mind are wonderful, wonderful people. And take the time to get to know them as people. I think it makes the career both more rewarding and more effective, right? Once you know somebody as a person, you have a better idea of how they come at science and how they come at research and teaching as well. And I think getting to know your fellow co-authors, the other people working in the area, people you see at conferences, is something that's always worth putting time into. Shouldn't just have conversations about research, right? Where you get to know the members of the division and your fellow entrepreneurship researchers as people.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom. And you were very generous with your time, and we truly appreciate it. Thank you.
You all were extremely insightful with your questions. And I'll just circle back to what Oscar was saying for a moment, because I guess it seemed, Vishal, once you clarified the question, yeah, it would be very, very logical maybe to put participants in a situation where you're telling them they need to pitch angels versus they're going to create a crowdfunding campaign, and how does that manipulation change their risk perceptions? So I think that'd be a tremendous idea. And I again want to say thank you to everyone for your questions. They were all extremely well thought out, and I really appreciate you giving me the time to talk with you today.
Thanks, Tom. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Okay, so that was Dr. Tom Allison. If you do work in entrepreneurial finance, crowdfunding, any of those areas, feel free to reach out to him on LinkedIn or by email. Most people who you meet are going to be very friendly individuals in that sense. They are very open to connecting with you and asking, answering any questions or concerns you might have. What questions do you have for us? Happy to answer any questions. We have some time. Priscilla, go ahead and ask your question then.
Thank you. I wanted to find out, when you get your comments from the reviewers and you have to do the point-by-point response table, how in-depth do you respond? And do you take like the changes in the manuscript and put it in the table? Or do you tell them go to page 5 and you would see the change there? And is it that I have to explain what I changed, or just tell them that it was done and see changes on the page?
Okay. That's a very good question, Priscilla. And I'll tell you this from my own experiences. This was one of the most valuable lessons I learned when I first started out. how to write response letters.